Welcome back. Now, President Cyril Ramaphosa urged global leaders to embrace inclusivity, cooperation, and reform as South Africa leads the G20 presidency for the first time. Speaking at the G20 foreign ministers meeting in Nasrec, President Ramaphosa emphasized the significance of hosting the G20 Leaders Summit on African soil. Now, this comes on domestic issues that happen, of course, in South Africa with the delay of the budget speech. But what does this speak on South Africa's role in shaping global politics, I beg your pardon, and how will South Africa take it forward to the main summit that will happen later this year? Joining me now, I'd like to welcome Dr. Oscar Van Heerden, who is from the Center for African Diplomacy and Leadership at the University of Johannesburg. Dr. Van Heerden, always a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for us, and thanks to the viewers.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. I think, Dr. Van Heerden, this came at a time where we had a budget debacle that was happening in Cape Town last week, but just the way South Africa was able to manage it from a diplomatic point of view, your take on it?
Yeah, look, I think we're making a big thing about the postponement of the budget. But the reality is that in European countries and many other countries where they are used to coalition politics, their governments are formed by coalitions. This is nothing new to them. Last minute jostling, elbowing each other out and so on. So it's the first time it happens in South Africa, but it's also the first time for us because it's the first time that we've had a coalition government, which we call the Government of National Unity. Usually, the ANC, being the dominant governing party, used to be able to just push through all the tax parameters and so on, and no one could object. Well, this time around, they've got 40%. They need their partners in the GNU. And ANC ministers, including opposition parties, said no to a VAT increase of 2%. And that's why we'll have to wait till the March 12th to hear the new budget.
Dr. Van Heerden, let's talk of the actual summit itself. A lot of what President Cyril Ramaphosa is looking at is this push for global South equality to match that of the North. How important is this going to be, given, of course, you've got the BRICS summit, but the BRICS summit really isolates itself from, the powers of the West. But this inclusivity that President Ramaphosa wants, is it a reality, or are we just being sold a potential pipe dream? Your take on it?
Well, remember, this reality is a dream that have been sold to us by the West. It's Western countries and developed economies that have told us, as the Global South, that if we follow certain rules, if we apply certain applications, if we indeed adhere to the Washington consensus, then we will be like them. We will develop like them. And it has been a long time since. And I think that, BRICS is really about countries in the Global South that is saying, how can we better work together? How can we enhance our trade and so forth? But with G20, it's about saying to the 20 largest and most powerful economies, what is it that you are doing to create equity, to create sustainability and solidarity within the world? And I think it's two different things. But as to whether those lofty ideals is something that we should aspire to, of course. Whether it will be actually achieved, that is entirely up to the G20.
Dr. Van Heerden, of course, we had an incident with Sergei Lavrov, who was, of course, fresh coming out of Saudi Arabia, of course, where the United States and Russia are trying to somehow repair its relationship. And I had John Pfeffer, who is a foreign policy expert within the United States, and he says, look, it's going to take a long time for the United States and Russia to go ahead and actually get its relationship repaired. But here at home, of course, there were reports that quite a number of foreign ministers did not want to be part of a photo op with Lavrov. South Africa, Russia, this is still a relationship that Pretoria wants to maintain. How does South Africa play this out, given that, of course, Lavrov himself could again be coming to represent Russia at the end of the year for the main summit?
No, absolutely. As far as what this indicates is precisely why the European leaders are not at the meeting with US and Russia. I think that it's precisely because they are not an honest broker that they have taken sides in this conflict. To say that you don't want to be part of a photo because the foreign minister of Russia is there, it means that how do you even become a an honest broker when you sit at the negotiating table. So this is indicative of how emotional and how invested the EU leaders are within the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And I dare say, unless there is maturity and people stop acting like children, we are not going to find a lasting peace between Russia and Ukraine.
Dr. Van Heerden, the United States of America, of course, Marco Rubio did not come last week. That relationship between Pretoria and Washington, I mean, the government, of course, gave the thumbs up to the United States for sanctioning certain Rwandan officials for its role within the M23 and the ongoing conflict that's happening in the eastern DRC. How much is Pretoria now going to really want to repair this relationship with Washington ahead of the G20 summit? Donald Trump has said, look, the door's not closed towards him potentially coming to the G20 summit, but this diplomatic row that the two countries had kind of puts a question mark as to whether this could actually occur.
Look, no one wants to be on the wrong side of the largest economy in the world. We want to have good relations with the United States, of course, but it's not going to be at the expense of compromising one's foreign policy and one's sovereignty. I think that is quite important. But having said that, the truth of the matter is that the United States have not completely boycotted the G20 because they've insisted, albeit a junior person from the embassy here in South Africa, but they've insisted to have eyes and ears in the meeting. In other words, they are interested. Otherwise, they would have just completely stayed away. They are interested. They know that even though they are not in the room, and even though they want to flex their muscle, the other 19 largest economies of the world is in the room. And so they have to play this delicate balance. And I do want to say, I do think it's correct to say that Trump has not yet closed the door on the actual leaders summit in November. You might find, and I think he actually will come, albeit to just take the mantle over the presidency of the G20 from Cyril Ramaphosa.
One final question, Dr. Van Heerden. South Africa as a whole, of course, it's seen as this country that has handled diplomatic issues quite well, of course, taking Israel to the ICJ, its role as a broker in the current Ukraine-Russia conflict. Of course, we have our soldiers were killed in the eastern DRC, but it seems that Pretoria really does not want to blow this up. One saw that in the AU summit. The test for South Africa's foreign policy, its role as a diplomatic nation within the southern tip of the continent. How do you see it? And what does government and President Cyril Ramaphosa do to try and make sure that it's seen in a good light as this beacon and this haven of diplomacy in a world that continues to change and continues to have this question mark in terms of conflicts which could occur?
The reason why the second largest economy in the world, China, including the European Union, supports South Africa's presidency is because they know that South Africa has had a consistent foreign policy, that it is within the parameters of international law, it is pursuant with human rights, and solidarity. And there is no indication whatsoever that South Africa has ever stepped outside of those bounds. So it is predictable, it is reliable, and it is consistent. And this is why many countries, as I say, China, Russia, Brazil, India, and the European Union, and many others are supporting South Africa in their presidency of the G20. And of course, just generally, in terms of diplomatic relations, the US is really finding itself on the outside as the isolated one, coming and basing their decisions on false information, misinformation, and false narratives spread by people inside our own country. And I think that's something we need to address. But the reason why people are supporting the South African government throughout is because they've seen over the last 31 years consistency and principles that is being applied by the South African government internationally.
Dr. Oscar Van Heerden, always a pleasure having you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for that.
That's Dr. Oscar Van Heerden, I beg your pardon, who is from the Center for African Diplomacy and Leadership at the University of Johannesburg. And of course, as the G20 finance heads lock horns this week, of course, it's going to be interesting how global economics takes place. South Africa itself wants to see a 3% GDP growth, but from a global perspective, how does that occur? What does South Africa do? Of course, currently we are having bouts of load shedding, so it's of course obvious that the energy question is going to come if there is going to be investment in the country, given that of course we've had load shedding after 3 weeks, and prior to that we had nearly over 300 days of power that has been supplied to the grid. Where do we as a country now go ahead and try and sell ourselves as a economic investment haven? Tough task for Treasury, especially for that of Enoch Godongwana. But as Dr. Oscar Van Heerden says, this is coalition governments. This is the way the government of national unity is going to go ahead and conduct itself. And currently, as cabinet sits, there's questions with regards to how the VAT discussion is going to go ahead. For now, that's the least of, well, I won't say the least, but it's one of the issues Enoch Godongwana can put to the side, as he now needs to convince the other G20 finance heads that South Africa still is a place to go ahead and be an investment haven. After the break on Friday, the crime stats were released. It paints a slightly, and I want to use this very carefully, optimistic picture that the murder rate has come down. But boy, doesn't South Africa have a long way in fixing its crime stats. I'm going to speak to TJ Masilela, who is the chairperson of the Gauteng Community Police Board, after this break.